Everyone is digging in, so we'll go ahead and get started with our next portion of this conference, which is a panel discussion with the discussants up here with David Campbell about American Grace and anything else, I guess, that they choose to grill him about. But we're going to just quickly first have the panel go around in 30 seconds or less, introduce who they are and why they're on the panel, if they know. Yes, but I guess I will start. I'm Luke Peterson. I'm the Director of Corporate and Community Partnerships here at Utah Valley University. Can you hear? I see the no hear sound. Is this on? It is on. Okay. Everybody's eating loudly. That makes it difficult. Yeah. I'm Luke Peterson. I'm Director of Corporate and Community Partnerships for Utah Valley University. And I'm here to be the policy wonk, from what I've been told. And so that's the angle that I bring to this. And very excited to discuss this topic. Great to you, Mr.
Sure. My name is Greg Johnson. I direct a nonprofit organization called Standing Together here in Utah. We specialize in engaging the evangelical Christian community in greater works of unity and building a bridge of dialogue with the LDS culture. I also serve on the board of the National Association of Evangelicals, and was fascinated by our last presentation.
I'm Bonner Ritchie. I'm Professor Emeritus from BYU and a scholar in residence at UVU.
We asked that everybody use a microphone because we're trying to capture.
I'm David Scott, Associate Professor of Communication here at UVU. I do research on religion, media, and culture. So that's why I'm here.
I'm Boyd Peterson. I teach in the English department, and I'm the program coordinator for Mormon Studies here at UVU.
I'm Blair Van Dyke. I teach at the Orem LDS Institute of Religion, and I'm also where I coordinate Mormon Studies efforts and interfaith engagement, and I'm also an adjunct in the Department of Philosophy here at UVU.
I'm Dennis Potter. I'm an associate professor of philosophy here at UVU and the former Mormon Studies coordinator and current associate director of religious studies.
Keith Longmore, instructor at the Orem University Institute of Religion, and I guess I'm pretty much an assistant to Blair in all the things that he said. So,
I'm Michael Minch. I'm the Director of Peace and Justice Studies and a democratic theorist in the philosophy department.
I'm Cecile Holmes. I'm an associate professor of journalism at the University of South Carolina, former full-time religion editor for the Houston Chronicle, and a past president of the Religion News Writers Association.
I'm Randall Paul, the president of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy. I studied at the University of Chicago at the Committee on Social Thought.
Okay, and with that, Brian was foolish enough to put me in charge, so I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask the first question. So, David, I'm very interested in this. We've got your foreign affairs article here that you and Bob did, earlier this year, published earlier this year. And the title is God and Caesar in America, Why Mixing Religion and Politics is Bad for Both. It seems to correlate a lot with one of the chapters in American Grace. What's of interest to me, again, as the policy wonk is, I agree with the thesis, the takeaways from American Grace about tying politics and faith seems to have a damaging effect on religiosity and the willingness to affiliate with organized religion. But what about public policy, right? How can we separate politics and public policy when public policy is so critical to deeply held faith-based beliefs?
Well, the first thing I would note is that it would be. Is this on? Can you? The first thing I would note is that it would be unrealistic, maybe even foolish, to think that in the contemporary United States, we could discuss most issues of public policy and not expect religion, or at least values informed by religion, to be a part of that debate. That has actually been the constant in American history. It's hard to point to any reform movement over the course of American history that does not in some way touch on religion, and in most cases, they had actual roots in religion. So it is not a new thing to have religion involved in politics or in public policy. What is new today is the identification, at least in the public mind, of one party with religion. Now, maybe that's an unfair characterization, because it is certainly not the case that there are, no Democrats who are religious, and it's certainly not the case that in the past there haven't been religious leaders who have been very visibly identified with the Democratic Party. But be that as it may, in the public mind today, one party is identified with religion and the other party is not. And that is the state of play that makes me uncomfortable. And I think it should make religious leaders uncomfortable for the reasons that I described. It does seem to have a detrimental effect on religion itself. So,
if I could just follow up real quickly. What's of interest is, from my perspective, one party effectively carved out religious conservatives as a constituency, or attempted to, right? The Republican Party. Then, if a church, the LDS Church or the Catholic Church, decides to take a particular policy stand which is going to de facto align with the position of the Republican Party because of the strategic direction they've taken, how can they continue to push forward on policy issues that are critical to them without effectively lining up with a particular party and being partisan?
Well, there are two elements to consider there. One is what the religious groups are doing. And, it's certainly not my place, and I would never presume to suggest what any religious leader ought to do if they feel called to make a statement or get involved in an issue. That's what they're in the business of doing. I would caution them that there is a difference between making statements of public policy and even trying to rally your members, your adherents to a cause, and getting intricately involved in the political strategizing that goes on, within a party. But the other thing to keep in mind is the situation that we're describing of this close association between religion and one side of the political spectrum is actually driven as much and perhaps even more by what the politicians do rather than what the religions do. And we've actually seen a drop-off in the last 5 years, this is important to note, in the amount of politicking in America's churches. It's actually one of the biggest changes that we've observed just in the last 5 years, and we think it's because clergy are picking up on this. They realize that this is something that many of their parishioners or potential parishioners are allergic to. They don't want to hear about politics of church. But we see no evidence that the politicians are moving away from using religious symbolism. You saw 2 ads from this current presidential cycle, and unless that changes, I don't think we would see this disassociation between religion and politics in the public mind. So it's not just the religions, it's also what the parties or the elected officials do.
I'm going to ask a question specific to Mormonism, because you're Mormon and many people here are, so many people may want to respond. But during the George W. Bush administration, hundreds and hundreds, perhaps thousands of Christians of all kinds made it clear very publicly that they were very much bothered by the notion, too easily portrayed by mainstream media, that the Bush policies and his politics were Christian, and that they represented the Christian church. And Mitt Romney has become the presidential candidate, and he's LDS, he's the candidate for the Republican Party. And there's scant, if any, LDS public discourse that is analogous to that which existed when George W. Bush was president. In other words, I would think there would be many, many, many public intellectuals who are LDS who would say precisely because we take our Mormon faith seriously, we cannot support his presidency, right? Because as we understand his policies and his politics, they're in violation of LDS faith, of our very values. But I see and read none of that. Can you explain why?
Well, I will say there have been a few Latter-day Saints who have spoken out in favor of the president or against Romney and drawn on their own LDS background to do so. Although I admit that's a vanishingly small number. So your point is well taken. Look, the fact of the matter is, Mormons as a group are the most Republican religious group in the country. Far more Mormons associate, and identify with the Republican Party than do evangelicals. Mormons voted in larger numbers for George W. Bush than even evangelicals did. And so it is perhaps not surprising, A, that just on partisan grounds, that most Mormons would be in line with any Republican candidate, and maybe especially one from their own tribe, which builds on my second point. It's clear from the data that I have been involved in collecting and that the Pew Research Center has collected that for many Mormons, they see in Mitt Romney the representation of their group of having arrived in America in the same way that perhaps many Catholics saw John Kennedy or to some extent Al Smith in 1928, both Catholics running for the presidency. My little point of evidence on this is just really quite remarkable, is that if you look at approval ratings of Mitt Romney among Mormons, Mitt Romney has a higher approval rating among Mormon Democrats, and there are Mormon Democrats, it's about 25%. His approval rating among Mormon Democrats is actually higher than among Republicans in general. And why would that be? Well, it's not necessarily because of his party, of course. It's because they see in him a representation of, Mormonism as almost an ethnic loyalty rather than a religious loyalty. Now, the debate that you're suggesting, I think, is one that should take place. I think it's a fascinating question. I think Romney's position on immigration is very interesting because it's not consistent with the church's position on immigration. And there are probably others we could point to where there probably should be more discussion of this, but I'm not confident we're going to see it, at least in the next 6 weeks. Did you want to follow up on that?
Well, I mean, I know everything you said, but I feel like... So, it doesn't really answer the question in a way. Because, yes, it's true that Mormons like Mitt Romney because he's a Mormon. Yes. It's true that Mormons are more Republican than all other religious groups. Yes. Nonetheless, there have to be a number of LDS persons who are have a kind of prominence in the intellectual world, in the political world, or the theological world. And one would think that for precisely Mormon reasons, right, that this would be a defense of Mormonism for them, right? They would, and you're right, I know there are voices, I know there are a few things said, but it is at the vanishing point. So, it seems to me there are other reasons. In addition, not instead of, but in addition to the ones you've mentioned.
David, I put the point in passing. In my neighborhood of 3 blocks, there are 10 signs that say Utah's pro-Obama in Brooklyn.
I still haven't read a letter in the New York Times signed by 25 Mormon intellectuals, right?
Boy, can I do that.
Okay.
You're going to have to sign 25 times.
There was an article, I just linked to it yesterday, but now I can't find it. It may have been in the Huffington Post or New York Times, but it was not that piece saying Mitt Romney doesn't represent my Mormonism.
I believe.
Greg Prince. Greg Prince.
Yeah, and I would cite too that LDS Dems is the fastest growing caucus, the biggest caucus now in the Utah State Democratic Party. And they had a group that met in Washington, or in Charlotte at the Democratic Convention. So I know that, and I know that. Still, you know, my point still holds. We're small.
This is really important.
So actually this last question also dovetails with the question that I have, because it's kind of raising this question about internal religious diversity. One of the things about your statistics that you showed is that evangelical Christians believe that other people are going to be in heaven with them, even from other faiths. And that's actually pretty surprising because very few evangelical theologians make any kind of room for that in their theology. You know, that's actually a rare position among evangelical theologians to talk about something like post-mortem, you know, salvation. And so it sounds to me that there's internal religious diversity in evangelical Christianity, and maybe the lay membership in that tradition are not always buying the theology that the theologians and the ministers are pushing. So here's my question: have you done any of your work on this statistical work on internal religious diversity? We talk about external religious diversity in the United States, but actually most people are Christian, and when we're talking about external religious diversity there, we're really kind of also talking about internal religious diversity. I mean, even between Mormons and traditional Christians, they all claim to be Christians, and there's an argument about whether Mormons get to own that term or not.
Talk a little bit about what happened in Charlotte with the issue of two sacred cows, the name God, and Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, being taken out of the Democratic platform and then being reinstated. Do you look at that as a kind of a political overreach, where the Democrats kind of sensed halfway through the convention we're doing too much damage, or is there more of a strategic kind of thinking going on, maybe to reach the nons and to engage the more secular youth, even who would affiliate as religious, within evangelical communities or other communities, kind of tapping into that dissonance with right-wing faith and right-wing experiences? How do you evaluate what happened with that issue?
Again, I actually have no inside information on this, so I'll just speculate, viewing it from the outside as a political scientist. Rather than think of what you're describing as efforts on the part of the Democratic Party to reach secular voters, I would actually turn that around and say it's more likely a reflection of the fact that we speak of the evangelicals as the base of the Republican Party. Well, in some respects, you can actually think of people who are quite secular as the base of the contemporary Democratic Party. And I suspect that what was happening there in the back rooms, where the real work of a convention is done, where the platform's put together and all of that is done, that there were people there who maybe actually had kind of a tin ear to this. They didn't recognize the omission. My understanding is it was the president himself who intervened on this matter and said, no, we didn't put that back in because, well, there's a reason why he's at the top of the ticket. His political instincts might be a little shrewder than those who are coming out of the grassroots. So that's how I would characterize that. It's indicative. In the larger picture, it's not going to matter. Most Americans, some in the room don't even know what we're talking about, but most Americans are not clued in on what is inside the platform or the backroom machinations in the convention. What matters is the public image of the party. And the public image of the Democratic Party and the public image of the Republican Party currently definitely is different when it comes to religion. There's a lot of talk of the Democrats trying to reach out to religious voters, and they do make some efforts in those.
God bless America more than the Republicans.
But it turns out that when you ask Americans about the public image of the party, in spite of those efforts, you still get this sharp divide, which says that there's something else going on. It's not just backroom positioning, it's more about the public presentation of the parties and the willingness to invoke God and the language of a war on religion and those sorts of things that really would resonate with the grace-saying half of America, but not with the other half, the non-grace.
David, just a question for clarification. Patrick Mason was on campus to deliver the Eugene England lecture a few months ago, and he talked about the secularization of Mormons and politics. and used that as a justification, or as a partial explanation at least, for Mitt Romney's lack of discussion of his Mormonism. Compare and contrast that to, so he's just Mormon enough, but he's not talking about it. Whereas Huntsman, earlier in the race, was clearly characterized as not Mormon enough for Mormons. And then a Washington Times piece, op-ed piece talking about, this is probably 8 weeks ago, Obama starting to employ God speak in his dialogue on the campaign trail. We clarify and massage a little bit more the parameters for religious enough versus not religious enough for either party.
Well, in the case, we'll take Romney first. In the case of Romney, he obviously has a dilemma that he thought in 2008 he had solved. And the dilemma, of course, is that he is LDS, a group viewed with suspicion among many in the Republican base. But on the other hand, he is a personally devout person, you know, in his own life, and he adheres to a tradition that, you know, on the social issues is characterized as pretty conservative. And so he thought that that would be enough to sort of overcome any theological suspicions that especially evangelicals might have about Mormons, just by emphasizing, well, the common values that we have, and that didn't work in 2008. So in 2012, he tries a different strategy where he just doesn't talk about religion much. There was some mention of it, of course, by the time we got to the Republican convention, but it was all the public service side of Mormonism, and not even really much language that Mormons would recognize. So, you know, Mitt Romney was consistently described as a former pastor rather than a former bishop, just as an example. I think it's perfectly reasonable to describe a bishop that way, but you know, to a Mormon, that's going to sound kind of weird. No, he wasn't a pastor, he was a bishop. So he has this dilemma that in 2012, he has navigated differently than he did in 2008. What I find interesting, and it's actually funny, I was in Southern California last weekend with Patrick Mason, we were talking about this. What I find fascinating is the contrast between Mitt Romney and his father, George. So when George Romney ran for president in 1968, he was much more open about his Mormonism. There's this wonderful interview that he gave, it was published in Dialogue in 1967, so it's while Romney was gearing up for the presidency, to run for the presidency, and he's expansive in talking about how his Mormonism informs his view as a leader. I mean, it's the sort of thing that you could not possibly imagine any politician, maybe even in the state of Utah today, saying. He's just very open about it. And it sort of raises the question, well, what changed between Romney 1 and Romney 2? And of course, the answer is the political environment changed, that now religion is not just a matter of invoking religion generically as a form of sort of civil religion. Religion has become this partisan thing, largely driven by the influx of evangelicalism into the Republican Party, which means that the son can't freely and openly talk about his faith in the way that the father could, because by doing so he introduces all the old questions about the theological tensions between evangelicals and Mormons. We will see here in the next few weeks how successful Romney is in negotiating that sort of difficulty within the Republican Party. Thus far, it appears that, in the way Jon Stewart put it, evangelicals, they hate Barack Obama more than they love Jesus, is the way he put it, because they're willing to vote for Romney and hold their nose because they really don't like this president. I know, I was a little worried they didn't laugh at that. That's Jon Stewart, not me. On the Democratic side, I'm not actually sure that it is a new thing for Obama to use God talk. He actually has, in the past, been quite willing to talk about religion on the stump. It may be that he has a new stump speech where he invokes it more than he has in the past. But you know, when Obama speaks, he often uses the cadences quite deliberately of a black preacher. I don't think there's any question about that. And that's going to resonate with some Americans, and it's not going to with others. And that's sort of the way politics works.
So
Brian's next, sir.
I have two questions. The first one's a two-part question, and I think it relates to the issue that Michael raised. And that is, I had a law clerk some years ago who the person who sat next to him This was during the Bush-Kerry campaign. And she was LDS, and he assumed she was going to vote Republican. And as he was talking to her, he was surprised to see that she'd looked at all of the issues, and she lined up with Kerry on 39 out of 40 issues. And he said, "So you're going to vote Democrat, right?" And she said, "No, Republican." And he said, "Why?" And the 40th issue was abortion. And she felt very strongly about abortion. So the question is how much there's a hierarchy of these different values, and how much some issues like abortion end up driving the election, driving the way people vote. The second part of that question is if there's been any studies done that would show if you could separate the social issues from the government issues, government operation issues, how people would vote and how that would change elections.
Sure.
Shall I save the second question?
It's going to sound like I planted this question, because this is actually a point that we make in American Grace and that is worth underscoring. It's the following: that when we speak of the political differences between religious and secular Americans, if I can use that language, or more religious and less religious, when we speak of divisions in terms of political attitudes, you actually only find sharp divisions, like the truly wide gulf, on two issues, and two issues only. One is abortion, and the other is gay rights, or specifically same-sex marriage. On those two issues, no surprise, religious and secular Americans are miles apart. On almost any other issue that you could name, religious and secular Americans are either very close in their attitudes, or in some cases, there's just no difference whatsoever. I mentioned immigration earlier. Immigration is actually one of those. That's not, lots of other things divide Americans on the question of immigration, but not religion. So what that means is, when we fight elections about those issues, the issues of abortion and same-sex marriage, you would expect the God gap. You'd expect religious and secular voters to differ in their preferences and who they're casting their ballots for. When we fight elections about other issues, which is what we used to do before the injection of the social or cultural issues into our politics, then you wouldn't expect religion to be what divides Americans. It would be other things, right? You're going to have division, that's what politics is about. But those divisions are not necessarily going to be along the lines of religion. Which I think also informs your first question about the rank ordering, if you will, of some issues over others. I'm a little surprised that in this anecdote you were saying that it was somebody, you said who was LDS, who had prioritized abortion over other issues. She's a bit of an outlier, actually. Abortion within the Mormon community doesn't have the same prominence that it does within evangelicalism or in the more conservative wing of Catholicism. But of course, most Mormons are anti-abortion. They just maybe don't prioritize it as an issue quite as much as you find elsewhere. But I think there are other social issues, specifically same-sex marriage, where you do find a greater resonance among Latter-day Saints than you might, at least in the general population. If you step outside of Mormonism and ask about the rank ordering of those priorities, it's kind of difficult to sort this out. When you ask Americans straight up, what are the most important issues facing the country today? No, very few people say abortion. Very few. They typically say the economy or something related to the economy. But when you look at how they vote, it does appear as though abortion matters a lot in what's shaping people's political opinions. So there seems to be a bit of a disconnect in terms of what's on the top of people's heads when you ask that question and what they actually do in the polling place.
So I think I'm going to just sum up what I got out of this, is that young people today are moving more away from organized religion toward more liberal politics. Is that kind of an accurate?
Actually, I would reverse that a little bit and say that of young people who have the liberal politics, which is most, but by no means all, young people, they're the ones who are the most likely to turn away from religion.
So is that same trend happening in Mormonism?
We haven't seen any evidence of that, but partly that is because Mormons as a small group are represented in the surveys that we do in the correct proportion of the population. But when you have a small group, it's much harder to parse out trends like this as they might be emerging. So that may be the case. We have not yet detected it. I certainly have heard a lot of anecdotes of people, maybe especially young people in California, who were either left the church or decided that they weren't going to participate in the church, that is the LDS Church, after the Proposition 8 campaign. We don't see evidence of that in national level data, but if we had more granular data in California, maybe we would observe it. It is worth noting that the defections from religion that I described vary across religious traditions. So some traditions are sort of better, if you will, at holding on to their young. And Mormons actually rank pretty high on that. They're a little better at holding on to their young people than evangelicals are. They're sort of similar to Jews, and Jews are complicated because it's really hard to stop being a Jew because it's an ethnic affiliation as much as it is religious.
So when you talk about hanging on, are you referring to hanging on as in they identify as Mormon, or that they actually practice?
Well, in that particular datum that I gave you is based on a question that just simply asks what your religious affiliation is now versus what it was when you were growing up. And we can, see the trend. But here's a sobering fact. It's still only about 60% of Mormon, or people who are raised Mormon over the course of their life continue to identify as Mormon. That means 2 in 5 are leaving the fold. That's a lower percentage, as I said, than you'd find in Catholicism and many other traditions, but it's still a pretty high number. I would say 40% is not anything to brag about.
I'm curious about 2 things. I'm wondering if you controlled or looked at the relationship between personal religiosity rather than church attendance as a factor or variable, just because to me it seems like in the United States, with an idea of kind of individual liberties, that element of our political construct of reality, it seems that it would make sense to have religion expressed more in terms of personal worship, like daily prayer or believing in God. And those variables, to me, might have nothing to do with going to church once a week, and yet those highly religious people might still be more evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. And there's a statistic here, and I apologize for quoting a Pew study on religion, given all the work you've done, but I just wanted you to address this in that context as well. Because it seems to me that, what was the aunt's name we were referring to? I didn't write it down. Aunt Susan.
You didn't write it down?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It seems like if Aunt Susan were another faith, that might be okay, but if Aunt Susan were a liberal or an atheist, the view might be different. And and I think this was 2010, but I could be wrong. But on these particular questions, whether people think the government should do more to protect morality, 40% of Americans, religious Americans, believe that. 54% of Mormons, by the way. 58% believe that creationism should be taught in the schools. 83% of Americans believe that Christmas displays should be on government property. 74% believe that the 10 Commandments should be in government buildings. And 69% believe, and they agree to the quote, liberals have gone too far to keep religion out of schools and the government. And so to me it's really interesting to have on the one hand government supposedly dividing people, and yet so many people of faith in the United States, they may not attend church regularly, but people of faith who believe in God still believe somehow there is this counter threat or agnostic or atheistic presence amongst Democrats or liberals in particular. Have you looked into that?
Let me address, I heard essentially 2 questions there. The first was about people's religiosity in their home or in their personal life is separate from attending religious services. I mentioned religious attendance in my talk. In the book, we actually talk in some depth about this, and when we speak of religiosity, it's actually not limited to church attendance. In fact, most of the measures we use are of precisely the type that you're describing. Prayer outside of worship, that is at home, reading scripture at home, or just subjective indicators of how religious you think of yourself as being or how important religion is in your life. And on all those measures, everything I said about the God gap holds. Okay? And actually the grace saying is meant to sort of get at that, because that's of course something that happens in your home or in some parts of the country, even in a restaurant, but certainly not in church. On the question of the statistics you were quoting from Pew, and I've collected similar data. In fact, I've also advised Pew, not on that particular study, but on other studies, and their data is the gold standard. So no question that what they're tapping into is a very real sentiment among most Americans, which is the following. Most Americans actually do not hold the same opinion about the Establishment Clause that the Supreme Court does. So most Americans are perfectly fine, as you said, with the Ten Commandments in public buildings and with Christmas displays, overtly religious Christmas displays on public land. Those are matters, however, that even among legal scholars you find disagreement on. So I think what you're really hearing Americans saying in those questions is, we like religion, and we like our own religion. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have completely, if you will, disqualified those of other faiths. Because most Americans don't see these as in conflict. Like they don't see a problem, like the Ten Commandments. What's wrong with that? You know, and they don't necessarily see how that might be an issue. On the matter of whether or not religious Americans view themselves as under threat by a secular society, no question that that's true. I've actually published some research on this. Evangelicals are more likely to vote Republican when they are in environments, social environments, where there are more secular people around them, as a reflection of exactly that sort of threat.
Is there maybe one last quick question? I have a long question, so I'm going to ask it after, but. Oh, go for it.
In the factors you've controlled for, did you look at economic deprivation and the impact of the economy at all, especially in your follow-up work? Because that's, so many people think that, you know, I mean, the classic line is, it's the economy, stupid. And still, that's being said even in this election when some people think it isn't the deciding factor. But I was curious as to whether or not it did come out.
That is the economy as a factor shaping how people vote?
Right, how people vote, how they're feeling.
Right. Well, it's always difficult to untangle all of these various factors, what leads someone to be in one party versus another. But generally speaking, among not just political scientists, but social scientists in general, it actually is largely economic issues that decide elections. I don't think there's any question about that. That doesn't mean the social issues don't matter. They do. They mattered in 2004. Same-sex marriage really did help George W. Bush at the polls. But at the margins. Now, we have close elections, so what happens on the margins matters. But this election will be primarily about the economy. It will not be primarily about whether you can vote for a Mormon, or primarily about whether or not religious institutions have to provide birth control as part of their health care plan. But for some Americans, and it could be a decisive block of Americans, those are the issues that will decide the election. Okay.
Let's give the discussants a round of applause and David Campbell. We'll take a 5-minute break and then go to the